It's very nice to see everybody here. As you can see, my name is John Pike. I'm going to talk today on a sustainable approach to property rationalisation and cost savings. I come at this from having managed many large UK estates over a number of years. And what has struck me over the last few years is the increase in the sustainable element of any strategies that I do. This is a relatively new phenomenon in my experience, perhaps 5 to 7 years, and all of a sudden it is now one of the most important elements of a property strategy going forward. If you can just indulge me a little, and I'll just tell you a little bit about my company. We're called CRE, Corporate Real Estate Associates, founded by myself and my colleague Ray Jenkins. We previously have direct experience of managing large estates. We have been the property directors of British Telecommunications plc, Network Rail, HBOS the bank, Honeywell and the Lloyds Banking Group. So I come at property strategy from actually having done it, from implemented it, from had to sell the strategies to the finance director, whoever it is in the company who is managing the particular process. We now, as a business, offer this advice, this direct experience to the corporate side and to the public sector side. We have, because of the nature of the way that property strategies have evolved into sustainability, we actually have a particular focus on developing environmentally aware portfolio reviews. Workplace strategies, which obviously feed into a sustainable way of working. And the important thing is to actually execute the resultant strategy to make certain it delivers what you originally set out in your statement to deliver. I also act at the moment as Secretary General of the International Sustainability Alliance. This is an alliance of very large European companies. Companies such as Standard Chartered Bank, EDF, ING, CBR Richard Ellis. Companies who are very interested in the sustainable performance of their estates with an objective of actually measuring that performance and improving that performance and benchmarking that performance. As a team, in our sort of past lives of property directors, this is the kind of estates which we have managed. Not quite as big as the NHS estate, I admit, but pretty large for all that. And as you can see, substantial savings can be achieved from the management and the proper rationalisation and the proper strategies for corporate estates. And I'll just keep my watch off, actually. Think about it. So when you look at the right property strategy, what is it? What is my experience of a property strategy? But it has to actually optimise the operations of the business, first and foremost. You have to understand the business, you have to know where the business is going, you have to identify the drivers of that business, whether it's in the corporate sector, or whether it's in the public sector, or whether it's in the NHS sector. It makes no difference. You have to understand the operations. I've never yet been anywhere where the main driver is not to minimise the costs of the estate. It's that sort of hidden elephant in the room. They tend to be huge costs, and in the good times, people forget it. I've been in many businesses where the sales side have said, we don't care about the property costs because we make so much money. But actually, these days, property costs, I think, are very significant. And if you're going to minimise costs, you have to identify rationalisation opportunities. How can you dispose of the estate? How can you slim down the estate? You also have to look ahead and sort of cater for future operational requirements. And it's interesting, again, with property, that actually sometimes I've found that going to the operation or the business and saying, we now need to build a property strategy, what is your business strategy? They've not really focused on it in the way that they should have done. And it's quite interesting that a property strategy, or the start of a property strategy, actually makes that operational business focus on where it wants to be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time, whatever it is. And I think that's very important. But however you develop the strategy, it's got to cater for future operational requirements. And it's actually now got to cater for the sustainable environment that we find ourselves in. and we've got to comply with statutory and legislative frameworks. And as I say, increasingly those frameworks come from the sustainable side as opposed to just building regulations or whatever. So sustainability, I find now, is at the core of any property strategy. And it wasn't, a few years ago. This is a relatively recent thing. And you could develop when I was sort of first starting to do property strategies, it's about the number of people, the locations, the kind of buildings you wanted to be in. But now sustainability is also absolutely fundamental to the development of a property strategy. It almost leads it in the first instance. It's not, or no longer, an optional extra. Most of us will know that first phrase. Buildings account for 40% of European energy consumption, 36% of CO2 emissions. We all know those sort of figures, but what that actually does is put property into the spotlight in a way that it never has been before. We have an EU energy roadmap. I should sort of say that actually most of the legislation, most of the regulation is driven by the EU. It comes from there originally. We have adapted it in the UK in certain respects, but the original legislation is from the EU. It defines a regulatory framework, and I thought I'd just sort of read from another slide that I'd had for a previous sort of presentation. And the current European status is that we have phase 2 of the EU emission trading scheme. Phase 3 will auction a greater proportion of allowances and reduce the cap on emissions, i.e. it's going to get more expensive for very large users of energy. The Energy Performance Directive requires all EU countries to introduce energy performance certificates. They will band, as you know, from A to G, but I think one of the things that the UK has introduced is that actually for F and G buildings, they will be unlettable in 2018. And it's really interesting that not a lot of people have picked up on that. So if you have F and G buildings in your portfolio, you will be able to do nothing with them by 2018, unless you obviously improve them, improve the sustainability or whatever, at great cost. I know very large companies now who are disposing of these buildings. They're selling them into the market. And meetings I've had, they've said to me, it's really interesting. Nobody actually asks us about F and G. How do these buildings comply with current environmental legislation? So a lot of companies are getting rid of these properties really quickly, and you need to understand this, I think. Display energy certificates, I suspect will be mandatory for all buildings. The 1,000-metre barrier, which above 1,000 metres you have to have a display energy certificate, that will sort of go, perhaps reduced to 500 metres. So the costs of complying with environmental legislation will become ever greater. And I think nowhere is that more clearly defined in the carbon reduction commitment that the UK has introduced. And it's interesting that Europe are now looking at the UK CRC scheme and thinking, well, this is a really good way to actually support the EU emissions trading scheme, to sort of develop that. So I think you will find CRCs will be developed European-wide fairly shortly. And of course, what happens with CRCs is that it's been turned into a tax. We all know that. And actually, the thing that really counts now for any sort of company or operation is the reputational risk. You don't want to be at the bottom of the league table. I've noticed actually a few NHS trusts have done very well in the latest league tables, so it is possible to achieve a really good performance. So smart organisations and companies are actually electing to act voluntarily. I think one needs to get ahead of this curve. There is increasing legislation. I mean, for some of the legislation, I think there's going to be mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reporting. Environmental reporting. It's interesting in France that already they have environmental reporting for all companies. All companies are obliged to report from an environmental perspective of their entire company operations, and they've got to have it audited. So it's a very serious sort of business. There's the new energy directive. Public sector have to reduce energy consumed by carrying out building works, building renovation works, covering 3% of their estate every year, year on year. So that's going to mount up. That is an additional cost. And therefore, you need property strategies and you need environmentally aware property strategies. That's the legislative side. Of course, actually, I think there is a value side to all this as well. And the value side is, I just sort of picked out a few reports here. The ECE report said that energy performance is a major factor likely to create value today. ING Real Estate, who've now actually morphed into CBRE, real estate investors, say that the reversionary potential for unsustainable buildings will become negative. The British Council of Offices says 60% of private sector buildings in London will become obsolete. Why does this matter to the NHS? Well, it matters because the simplest way to reduce the carbon footprint of your estate is to get rid of those properties which you don't need. But actually, you're not going to be able to get rid of them if they don't actually meet certain environmental standards. It's going to be much more difficult, they'll be sold at a loss, and maybe you won't be able to make the business case for them. The Maastricht University did a report for the Building Research Establishment, which I'm involved in as well, saying that BREEAM ratings in the UK have a positive 21 to 26% effect on rental value. So already we're seeing certification has an impact on value as well. We now understand, I think sustainability is a two-edged sword, actually. On the upside, if you do have energy-efficient buildings, they depreciate more slowly, and depreciation is a big cost on the balance sheet of any organisation. They have higher market value, so if you have to dispose of them, you can. But also, good, sound, environmentally sound buildings, that is, have lower running costs, and we're all into actually, come later to the targets the NHS have. The reverse side of that is that those buildings that aren't sustainable will become unsaleable in the future. And I think also that the point about sustainable buildings is that they have an impact on your staff, and we've just heard only this morning about the Mori report. So obviously people and your stakeholders, staff and stakeholders, have taken a big interest in the sustainable performance of the estate. It is very, my view, and I've always sort of prescribed this with companies I've worked for, that actually if you have the best sustainable buildings, if you have the most environmentally sustainable buildings, you attract the best staff. Very simple. And who doesn't want to attract the best staff? So I think it's important from a people perspective as well as a cost perspective. These figures will be well known to you, I'm sure. The NHS has 25 million metres squared of occupied floor area. It's the largest building portfolio in Europe. It is absolutely huge. It has a value of around about £36 billion. And an estimate I saw by the Treasury was that something like 12.5% is actually vacant or underused. Energy costs are of the order of 500 to 600 million, so there is a real opportunity to save there. And the 4 million tonnes of CO2 emissions is out of, I think, the total of 20 million tonnes CO2e that is produced by the NHS. So it is around about 1/5 of all CO2 emissions. So that is the property portfolio. That is what we have to play with. And I'm very conscious that actually for most of you in this room, you'll be playing with a small part of that. You won't actually be seeing the overall figures, but I don't think the strategies are any different. I don't think that you approach it any differently just at the macro level or at the individual sort of trust level or whatever. The principles are the same in developing a property strategy which actually delivers real savings, better property, and a more environmentally aware property estate. So if we look at the challenge, the challenge that you all have in this room, obviously, is to the 20 billion challenge by, 2015. So somehow that cash has to be raised, and can only be raised out of the NHS, and definitely a part of that has to come from the estate itself. And I'll come to some of the strategies that I've sort of put in place for BT and HBOS. And property plays a major part in any cost reduction exercise. It plays a major part in terms of the capital needed to run the estate and the revenue needed to run the estate. These are just some of the figures that you'll know. The NHS is targeted to reduce emissions by 10% by 2015. And I divided out, you've got here current energy costs. You can probably save circa 10% of your energy costs, 60 million, just by managing consumption. And I think that sustainability actually is a pretty simple process initially. You do the simple things first. You just switch off the lights. I used to switch off the lights. And all the companies that I went, I'd actually literally go, I'd get the security guards to switch off the lights in the evening, to switch off the PCs. You do the simple sort of stuff. You actually then have the 120 million, which is targeted investment. You can only target investment if you can make a business case, if you can actually demonstrate that there is real value in actually spending that cash. But that 180 million is a figure which I've seen published by the NHS. But I am actually convinced the largest impact comes from having a smaller property portfolio. If you have a smaller portfolio, you have less cost, you have less environmental problems, and therefore you need to make certain that the portfolio is right-sized to the business. Now, I realise that that's easy to say, but when you've got an estate as disparate as the NHS, from very large hospitals through to, I suppose, community hospitals, doctors' surgeries and so on, this takes a lot of doing. But I think the principle is broadly it. You can't afford to have property that you don't need. And I think that the footprint-related sort of aspect of this is the initiative which will, over time, move patients perhaps away from hospitals into the communities. I was a non-executive director of a community provider, so I saw this at first hand, and I saw that gradually over time we would actually start treating patients more at home, more locally, rather than sending them into the hospital. We constantly sort of had this debate that actually nobody wants to go in a hospital. Nobody actually wants to spend time in hospital unless they absolutely have to. Therefore, the best way of treating people is to treat them at home or treat them locally. So I think that that will be, well, obviously it is part of the strategy and it will sort of develop over time. That gives you the opportunity to right-size the portfolio. And it's important then to know, whichever side of that fence you're on, which properties you need, which properties you don't need. So whether it is a hospital and you have lots of outlying properties that you no longer need, that's one way of rationalising. Whether it is as a community provider, you've got 50 or 60 properties dotted around the place. Do you really need all of them? You need to have those sort of strategies, but you need to understand what the strategy of the trust is or the provider is. Also put down sort of underlying of all this obviously is benchmarking. I do a lot of benchmarking on the sustainable front with the Sustainability Alliance. We measure the environmental performance of the estates of these sort of big companies. We measure it with KPIs on energy intensity, energy, CO2 intensity, water, waste, all those sort of things. We get KPIs, which enables them to actually then understand how their estate is improving, if indeed it is. It also enables you to make a business case if you have benchmarking, because you can say, if I reach this benchmark, that will save me X in terms of pounds, which means I can then capitalise that in order to make the investment, and that's very important. So what you don't know, you can't manage. It's as simple as that. And I think that benchmarking, I obviously understand that the NHS does it, I think, by the bundle, is my direct experience. But even so, it's getting that sort of benchmarking correctly focused. So effective property strategies, what do they look like? When I was at BT, we inherited this sort of very dated estate. There was 85 million square feet, 8.5 million square metres in 10,000 properties. It cost 1.2 billion just to run the estate, and a lot of the office population was in central London. And we had at the time, and I remember it only too well, we had a debt, BT had a debt of 30 billion, and it was unsustainable as a debt, and it had to be reduced. Interestingly, it had to be reduced to 10 billion. The challenge is sort of the same figure as yourselves, 20 billion, although obviously one is capital, one is revenue. So we had that sort of challenge, and we had to make, and the estate had to play a significant role in that. We modernised the estate. We created flexible working around regional hubs. Wherever I've gone, I think you need to identify what is the appropriate strategy for your business. So, for instance, when I was at Network Rail, the strategy tended to revolve around railway towns. That was where the skilled people were. That's where your workers were. So we actually, interestingly, developed hubs in places like York and Swindon, very unlikely locations. When I was at HBOS, we developed strategies for Scotland, Edinburgh, and then for the sort of the Leeds, Bradford area. That's where the people were. So you need to understand where your regional hubs can be, how you can compact into them. We produced a lot of flexible working at the time, more flexible, and this was in the early days of flexible working, I have to say. This is when it first sort of came about, because all of a sudden, back then, say, something like 15, 20 years ago, you had the technology. Before that, you didn't really have the technology. Then all of a sudden, BT itself was developing the technology. So we had agile working became widespread. We had, and we actually reduced the running cost of the estate to 800 million. And at the same time, the estate became a showcase for BT's technology. And our contribution to the 20 million or so was to actually 2.38 billion. I'm sorry, the 20 billion was 2.38 billion pounds, which we actually achieved through a sort of sale and leaseback of the estate. HBOS had different issues, and I sort of demonstrate these because every estate you come at it from a different place. With HBOS, we had a very fragmented estate because it was formed by the merger of Halifax in England and the Bank of Scotland, obviously in Scotland. So we had property all over the place. It cost £400 million per annum to run, which meant actually with so many properties, our capex was spread too thinly. It was not possible to keep the sort of standards, particularly of the branches where the customer interfaces with the bank, up to a standard. And something like 20% of administration expenditure was directed to property alone. So we actually introduced developed a property strategy which focused on what was important to the bank. Agile working, flexible working. And we created 4 work styles which suited the bank's purpose. Rationalisation, so we actually decided where were the key locations that the bank needed to be, and we focused fewer buildings in those sort of key locations. I think cost leadership is very important as well, because what you find certainly in the commercial sector, and I'm not too certain whether this applies to the NHS, is that you have a mix of freehold and leasehold buildings. If you just charge them at the lease rent or the freehold, or you just say, well, it's a freehold building, it's free. I used to sort of always, in my presentations to the bank, hyphenate free, because that's what people thought of as far as freehold buildings were concerned. There were no charges. So one division might be a very effective division, but would have huge costs because it's got leasehold properties, and the other lesser costs. So cost leadership is about recharging the asset on a broadly equivalent basis across the estate to the business units, actually to reflect the opportunity cost of the property they sit in. And that doesn't half drive different behaviours when people suddenly realise a true cost. And all of a sudden, from being, well, no, I never want to leave this building, they can't wait to get out. And we had to introduce a strong sustainability driver. If you look at the costs, I reckon, of any estate, you find that something like a third is, say, rent and rates, fixed costs. You're contractually obliged to pay those figures for whatever the length of the lease is. You have depreciation. Depreciation is that you can't actually get out of that. That's maybe a third. So only a third that's left. You perhaps have a third which you can actually play with, which is actually the running costs of the estate. So you've really got to focus in on the energy costs particularly. Remove those buildings which are unlikely to comply with legislation in the future, because they will become a real cost and burden. Because, as I say, you won't be able to sell them. You'll have to refurbish them. Where are you going to get the money from? You won't have it. So we had a strategy there which focused on those 4 key aspects. Obviously, again, different companies have different drivers, but broadly, I think that's probably where we would be coming from. So the strategies might be different, but the execution should be consistent. Once you've got your plans, once you've got your strategies, you should execute accordingly. Making it happen, of course, it's all very fine to sort of stand up here and say, this is a strategy, but actually making it happen is really difficult. And of course, there is, this is a business plan. It's not a property plan. The property plan supports the business. You've really got to be able to demonstrate to the business or to the operation or to the hospital or whatever it is that actually your plans will support them to deliver a better service, a better product. You will get nowhere unless you can sort of demonstrate that. It's a program, not a project. I think that if you treat this just as a short-term project, you probably fail. This is a long-term program. Property is a long-term game. It is not possible just to exit property, to change property, to invest in property overnight. It can take years to get to where you want to get to, which is why you need really to understand the business. You need to scope the financial size of the prize, i.e. that underlies or underpins your business case. If you don't know how much money this is going to save, how much money you're going to have to invest, where the benefits are going to arise, you get no further, certainly with the finance directors that I've dealt with. And but there are lots of wider benefits, I think, with a properly thought out property strategy. There are wider benefits in terms of creating better accommodation in better locations, will actually enhance the reputation of the business that you're actually supporting at the time. Identify senior sponsors is, again, my direct experience. I think if you look at government, it's interesting, isn't it, that as long as I've been in the property business, central government is going to be moving its civil servants out of central London. It has never happened, and it never will happen, because they haven't got the senior sponsors, the senior civil servants don't want to go. And unless you engage these guys, unless they actually think, well, there is worthwhile, and some have, to be fair to them, but unless they think it's worthwhile, your strategy falls away. So you have to identify the senior sponsors in any organisation and make certain they're on side with your property strategy. You need a pan organisation governance structure. I've dealt with lots of strategies, and generally, as well as having the property guys on board, you have to have the IT guys, and you have to have the HR guys on board, and then you have to have the business division itself. And if you all work together, you're likely to get somewhere. If you as property try to impose a strategy, the chances are you will fail. And one obviously needs regular progress to review the strategy. Changes need to be made as you go through a strategy. I mean, for instance, if I look back to BT days, we had a great property strategy, involved all the buildings that BT had, and then suddenly the company decided it was going to demerger what was then O2. And so, all of a sudden your strategy falls away because a substantial number of the properties belong to a part of the company that is now going to establish itself in the long run. So you need to have that flexibility. And you need regular and consistent communications, and I can't stress that enough in terms of communications. Those are communications to your staff, to your stakeholders, to anybody who might have an interest in the strategy. And of course, the communications can be very positive, especially if you're now developing an environmentally friendly strategy. Everybody wants an environmentally friendly strategy. It is very difficult to argue against it. So I think that communications, and I've tried all sorts of ways of communicating, but generally you have to get your message across. People might not actually particularly want to go where you want them to go, but if they see the sense in it, if they see the advantages, they tend to come round to it. I've just put a bit about flexible working. Obviously, flexible working applies to only part of the estate, the administration sort of side largely. But actually, by having flexible working, you can achieve substantial reductions in space and the correspondent reduction in carbon footprint. People then say, but actually, if you reduce the office areas, you cram more people into smaller office areas, doesn't that actually increase your carbon footprint? And I think it does, but only to a sort of a small degree. It's not a like-for-like equation, and therefore there are benefits to actually having flexible working, reducing the space. I think supporting clinical staff to be more mobile reduces the need for consulting rooms. And I was particularly keen on the IT infrastructure. And again, this is a real challenge for the NHS. But actually, if people don't have to travel back, and that's what we tried to achieve in North Yorkshire, where I was a board director, actually people don't have to travel back to the office in order to do their notes, in order to upload the information that they've sort of gleaned during the day. So IT, I think, can have a big impact on sustainability around travel costs, funnily enough, more than anything. And there was there's a case history that BT, I got from BT, which is interesting, which is that it's this, I have to read this out actually, the South Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust. Kind of trips off the tongue, that one, doesn't it? They have a budget of 200 million, 5,000 employees, and a population of about 1.5 million to serve. They introduced flexible working for their healthcare staff, which released a surplus estate of something like £1.5 million. So it can be done. Flexible working can actually reduce the property that you occupy, increase the sales receipts, and reduce your costs. Again, these should be, I think, what's important about this is the landscape now for NHS property. You have the 2015 cost challenge, of which you have to contribute something. It's only sort of fairly recent, so getting the details is slightly difficult, but I think the creation of a propco will drive the pace of change for the surplus estate. And the propco is likely to set, if I was running it, you'd set efficiency targets which encourage either improved utilisation on the one hand, or the release of surplus estate on the other hand. I think if I was on the other side to the propco, what I'd be very careful about is actually just which properties I keep myself beyond the establishment of the company, and which properties I actually want to go into the propco because I don't need them. I think that you will be making decisions as to the properties you need, the properties you've got to hold. Just bear in mind that once you've got them, it's one heck of a job to get rid of them. So again, I would, if I was in any of your seats now, be really understanding the property strategy for my part of the operation, in order that I can tie it into this sort of propco. And the primary care estate itself, those parts that aren't tenants now become a tenant, and you need to make certain that you only hang on to the properties that you really need. The only way of knowing that, it's a bit like an envelope. You can't sort of define what properties to sell, what properties to occupy, what investments to make, how sustainability will impact, without actually having an overall envelope that says, this is my strategy, these are the properties, this is the strategy for the business, this is where we need to sort of go. And I think with the foundation hospitals, generally, probably the strategy is more about filling the core areas and rationalising and releasing the outliers. Whatever the approach, you can be pretty certain that property is under intense scrutiny. The spotlight is on property, and actually it's not going to go away at all. So in conclusion, we have ever-increasing regulation, as I've described, particularly coming from the EU around sustainability. I think this is a major will have a major impact in terms of costs going forward now. You need to continually, you need to understand how to future-proof the buildings against rising energy costs, de-risk the investment and reduce the costs. You need a strategic approach to your property assets, which means that you need to understand the full impact of the state of sustainability, how it will drive costs, how it will better the business. And then the NHS propco, is that going to have an impact on what you do? But I think overall, it is a footprint that drives the cost of carbon. It drives the carbon footprint. So your floor area footprint drives a carbon footprint. So I was chatting to somebody outside, and we're talking about, I don't know, smart meters and this kind of stuff. And it is very easy to say we need this sort of technology or that technology in our buildings. And I've done it. Inevitably, you fall into the trap of spending a lot of money on things like that, and actually then you realise you don't need the buildings, so you've wasted your money. So this property strategy has to be the first port of call. Only then can you decide where you're going to invest and how you're going to invest. And that's me done. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, I think we've got 5 or 10 minutes. And we've got a microphone at the back, so I'd be grateful if you just wait until the microphone arrives if you wish to ask anything. We've got one at the front. Well done. The first brave one.
That's functioning, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just going back to the point you made near the beginning about the buildings that are going to be rated as Fs and Gs and the legislation that they won't be lettable. I'm just interested, given your experience in the market, whether you think that's going to be enforceable, whether it's going to go through the courts for test cases, and then really what's going to happen to all that surplus property if it can be enforced.
Yeah, that's right. It is a long way ahead. So actually, I think you're right. A lot could happen in legislative sort of procedures between now and then. I was, and the problem, but I suspect, in the UK we do tend to follow legislation. I was asked questions when I was doing another sort of conference about these sort of aspects, and people were saying, well, despite what the EU legislates for, do you really think the Greeks and the Italians and the Spanish are going to actually do any of this? Because the chances are they won't, because they have far greater problems than actually enforcing a rather obscure part of the law. So, but I think the objective here is actually to get people to focus on improving the sustainable performance of their estates. And all you can say is, at the moment, that legislation is due to come in. So I don't know, it might not. It might be watered down, or it might not be. But I would have a strategy that makes certain I'm not the one left holding the baby right now, that I get rid of these things as quickly as possible. Because I tell you, a lot of big companies are getting rid of these properties, and they're selling them to people who are less knowledgeable right now. And they're going to be stuck with a big problem. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
When you were talking about HBOS, you mentioned 4 work styles.
Yeah.
I just wondered what you meant by that term, and if you could describe each of the 4.
That's a test, isn't it? It was a range of work styles, really, from those people who had to sit at a desk, had to have, well, some guys have 2 or 3 screens. Obviously, they're in the markets, and they have a fixed desk. They arrive in the morning, and they go home late at night, and they never move from those desks. So that was one way. So you have to identify those people. At the other extreme is the sales force. They actually don't need a desk at all. They were completely mobile, and as long as you gave them the mobile equipment that they could sort of log in, log out, and chase their customers, that was fine. And in between were different categories of work style. I mean, if you're interested, I'll have to dig them out, to be honest. But obviously, some people need a building to go to. They don't need to sit at a particular desk in a building, but they do actually go to that building every day. At BT, we had a building called Leavesden, which was superb. And this was a building that we developed, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, was it, Ray? Something like that. A long, long time ago. And but it was a really flexible building, and people just came in, logged in, and sat down at the desk that they needed to. Of course, all this fails because of people. So you don't want to get too upset about it. And you have these, and at HBOS I experienced many a time, we have beautiful layouts, just sort of first come, first served. There's no ownership of desks. So everybody rushes in on the first day, puts their pictures and everything else on the desk closest to the window, and they never move. And you can't get too worried about that. People will be people, and they do want their sort of space. But broadly, as long as you make the sort of savings that you need to make, I think flexible working, can work. Thank you.